Good afternoon. How many of you are elected officials or former elected officials? So in part this is about you, but it's about leadership. I believe several things. One is that we're at a moment in time when change has to happen, and change doesn't happen easily. It entails risk, and good things don't happen by accident. They happen because of intentionality. People that see an opportunity when others don't see it and take advantage of it. And I want to tell a story about that. How many of you know who Horatio Nelson Jackson is? One person. You all fail American history. And he changed your life. I'll tell the story quickly. Horatio Nelson Jackson was a doctor from Vermont. And he was in California at a medical convention, out to dinner with a group of other doctors, and they were debating the impact of the automobile on American society. And all the doctors, as smart as they are, thought it was going to be a toy for the rich. Wasn't going to have much impact at all. And Horatio bet them $50 that night he could drive across the United States in 90 days. And they all laughed and took the bet. And the very next day, Horatio bought his first car and convinced the young mechanic, Sewall, Crocker, to go with them. And for whatever reasons that day, they bought a dog named Bud. Then the very next day, with no planning and no organization to speak of, they were on the road driving across the United States. It was 1903. And in 1903, there were 8,000 cars in America, 150 miles of paved road, and no highway department in any state. Horatio, Sewall, and Bud drove down Fifth Avenue in New York City. 63 days later, they were the first people to drive across the United States. That was in 1903. By 1923, there were 10 million cars in the United States, hundreds of thousands of miles of paved road, and a highway department in every state. Society, as we knew it, changed completely in that 20 years. And many of you are planners or people involved in public life, and a 20-year time frame is the time frame we talk about. Well, we're sitting where Horatio Nelson Jackson was, looking at a world that is fundamentally getting redefined. Globalization, environmental issues, technological innovation, demographics, and talent, and the competition for talent, and how you pay for the future are all forces that are impacting how we're going to be. You know, if you're on the east coast of the United States or along the Gulf, there are 16 ports in the United States now that are spending in excess of $500 million to expand their ports, and billions of dollars for rail and road, chasing the traffic coming through an expanded Panama Canal that's now going to come from China instead of going to the West Coast. It's impacting Oklahoma City and Norman, as well as thousands of other cities around the United States. It's changing how we think about where things are made and how they move. Environmental issues, you can believe in climate change or not, but things are changing. And zoning is changing, and how people build buildings and the requirements of buildings are all changing because of the concerns about how we manage the environment. And it is having huge impact on how we're building this country. I don't need to talk about technological innovation. Demographics. How many of you get AARP magazine? Go out, give it up. If you get the AARP magazine, about every month or 2 months, they have in their magazine, which is a great magazine, they have articles about the best places to live. And it's always about walkability, and about affordability, and about having easy access to restaurants and being able to live in a place where you can walk to those places. Even more dramatically are our kids. The millenniums, the largest population bubble in America's history, from having 83 million people. Overwhelmingly, they are changing the landscape of America because they're choosing to want to live in walkable places, either big cities or small towns. For the first time last year, there were more people, for the last 70 years in the United States, more people moving to cities, urban areas, than there were to the suburbs. And that is in large part millennials making choices about where they want to live and how they want to live. And talent is everything. Cities are being driven by their ability to attract talent. What's the single most important investment that a city can make? Yell it out. Education. And what are we seeing across America? education, both secondary education and primary education, getting whacked, when it's the single most important competitive advantage we have as a country, and what we have for every community to have. So let me give you, and you can see you're the second in the bottom, and I won't. Virtually every city in America has lost anywhere from 30 to 50% of their manufacturing jobs in the last 20 years. So Baltimore, for example, lost 58% of their manufacturing jobs, and 56%, and San Diego lost 23%. You've lost in the last 20 years 18% of your manufacturing jobs, but in the same period of time, your jobs in professional services, and particularly in education and healthcare, have almost increased 100%. So if I'm looking at your future and talking about where you should invest, not to say that you don't continue to invest in manufacturing, but you now have twice as many people working in jobs that are higher value, requiring education, than you do in manufacturing, which traditionally has not required the same education. What are you going to invest in? You're going to invest in continuing to build on that talent. And that is happening all over America. And part of what is driving that talent is our willingness to invest in research and development in our universities and in our colleges and hospitals. There, as you can see, the big blue bubble in the middle is the United States. We invest in research more than any other country in the world. In fact, in many ways, almost more than any other, most of every other country combined. We're investing in research. And that research is the raw material. It's like oil in the ground. Oil has no value when it's in the ground unless you build the infrastructure. And that is what cities are doing all across America. They're building the infrastructure, partnering with universities to create that commercialization of that research that is driven by talent. And so the University of Oklahoma looks at almost $220 million a year coming here that is being invested in research. That's public and private dollars being invested in research. How you as a community see that as oil in the ground, as a way to create and diversify your economy, becomes a very important part, or should be an important part of the conversation in this community. And so cities have these pieces that are scattered. They have a sense of history. Every city is here for some reason. Maybe that reason has disappeared, but it is here, and how do you put those pieces together? We're like a jigsaw puzzle. And let me give you some examples. Denver is an example of a city that made an intentional decision to raise taxes on themselves to invest in a mass transit. And they built, as you might know, a 120-mile mass transit system called the Fast Track. If you've been to Denver and you've seen Union Station, you know that there are now billions of dollars being invested privately around Union Station in 3,500 new units of housing and millions of square feet of retail and commercial investments because of that investment in that infrastructure of understanding. And there is a dozen or more stations along that line, and they're seeing multiple investments also. So Denver made a choice, an intentional choice to invest in something. There was opposition to it, and yet people saw the future and made an investment. And this is the investment you see just in Union Station. If you've been to Denver, it's worth taking a walk down to. It's one of the best developments in America. Oklahoma City is a great story. And it was alluded to. This is a choice a city made. Oklahoma City made a decision to tax themselves, to get the financing to invest in the future. And Oklahoma City is, and I use this, I've been to 45 cities in the last 8 months, and this slide is in every one of them. So I talk about this is a choice, an intentional choice that the citizens of Oklahoma City made to invest in the future, not to sort of wait for the future to happen, but to invest in it. I have to take a moment and talk about the city where I was mayor and where I was born and raised, Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was once known as hell with the lid off. How would you like to be mayor of a city that was known as hell with the lid off? It was that because it was the industrial center of the world. 60% of the steel was made there, and that collapsed. That collapsed in a 7-year period. And so in 1983, Pittsburgh hit rock bottom. Unemployment rate was 22%, and 50,000 people a year were leaving Pittsburgh. So the region lost 500,000 people. That's why there's so many Pittsburgh Steelers fans here, because there are people that left. And the city of Pittsburgh went from having a population of 620,000 people to just over 300,000. Think about that. We were the Detroit of America in 1983. And by 2013, Pittsburgh has been ranked by The Economist magazine and Forbes and others as the most livable city in America. How does that happen? That happened because we were willing to think of the world in a different kind of way, to not think about simply managing in place, but to say, what do we need to do to think about managing a city that wants to grow again? We had thousands of acres of abandoned steel mills. This was one where my father worked for 51 years in a steel mill, along with 10,000 other men and women. There's now a cheesecake factory there. He would shoot me if he were alive. And yet the mills had been shut down, and that property was sitting there vacant for 15 years, reminding us of what we had lost. And so we developed thousands of acres of property. We use arts and culture as one of the important economic drivers that brings people in, that creates a real sense of place. And we created, with the help from our foundations, a real cultural mecca called the Cultural Trust District in the city. When I was growing up in Pittsburgh, my mother would always say to us when we were going out to play, be home before the streetlights come on. And she would always say, never go near those rivers. If you go in the rivers, you're going to melt. And the rivers were not something that we ever thought about going to. And now there's miles of riverfront trail. In fact, you can ride a bike off-road all the way from Pittsburgh to Washington, D.C. It's a great ride if any of you are bike riders. It's about a 5-day trip. And so we celebrate our rivers now. You can actually fish in them and eat the fish. And first you can catch them because there were no fish living there, and now you can eat them. So, and we partnered with the universities, because when our steel mills went down, it was not clear where we were going to work, and the people that were leaving were young people because they didn't see a future for themselves. And that's the challenge for every city, is to give kids a sense of future, of where they can go and the opportunities they have, the kind of diversity and employment that exists. And in our universities, the president of Carnegie Mellon, the first person I ever said that, said the universities can be the economic drivers of the region. And it was hard to imagine how the universities could replace the steel industry, but they have in Pittsburgh. And so there are hundreds of companies now that have started up in Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh that populate the city of Pittsburgh, employing thousands of people. But companies like, this was an old Nabisco bakery building that had sat vacant for 20 years. And Google was doing some research at Carnegie Mellon and continued to expand the research. And now they've moved 600 people into this building, to give you a sense of how powerful what universities are doing, developing the raw materials of that, of how powerful it is in employment. So this whole neighborhood, which was a blighted neighborhood, is now turned around, and 70% of the Google employees either walk or ride a bike to work. And so it changes the whole nature of it. And what Pittsburgh did was to create an investment fund. We made a decision, and with a tough economic budget, to set aside some money, $60 million, to invest in the future and not just use it to invest in today. That's the challenge that every community has. Do you invest today in more police and fixing potholes, or do you invest in building things for the future, taking a risk with that? An interesting example was in Cincinnati. There's over the Rhine in Cincinnati, and the downtown were both failing in Cincinnati, and the business community, led by Procter & Gamble, came together and went to the city and said, we want to lead a revitalization effort in Cincinnati. And the business community raised $50 million privately. This is no public money. This is private corporations committing $50 million. And they have partnered with the city. The city is a partner in this. They created which is called 3DC. You can check it out. And they've partnered with the city, and they are driving the downtown development and over the Rhine, which was one of the real blighted neighborhoods of up against the downtown in Cincinnati. Probably one of, you can see it had 500 vacant buildings and 700 vacant lots in it, and just a 10 square block area. That area has become the place to live in Cincinnati. In just the last 6 years, there's over $1 billion worth of new investment happening in that neighborhood. So it will give you a sense. So what are the pieces of the puzzle? How do cities move from doing okay to reaching for the future? First of all, is how do you think strategically? You know, developers, I love them, but they're going to show up, and their world is about how do you develop this piece of property. It's driven transactionally. There needs to be a growing up in the room that says, how do those pieces fit together? How do we build not just a series of developments, and every city in America has them, where they're disconnected, they look different, their backs or the fronts of the buildings are going different ways. How do we build a great place? How does that happen? Who's the growing up in the room that's thinking about the future and how these things get connected? That is a really critical piece of it. The second is, who's sticking their head up and willing to get it cut off? Who's the leader? It can be the private sector, it can be the public sector, but somebody needs the lead. Somebody needs to say, we're here and we're doing okay, but we want to be here, we want to reach. And who's going to reach? Who's going to challenge all of us to think about our city and to act in a different kind of way, to take risk with both public and private money that will get us to the future? It could fail. You know, that's the risk. And so that's a big part of the challenge. And this is a picture of Charleston, where I think the best mayor in America has been for 40 years. Joe Riley. He's been mayor for 40 years. He's retiring this year. And if you've ever been to Charleston, you know it is a remarkable city. And it was driven by where Joe Riley believed that historic preservation could be the driver for this city. And he was able successfully to do that. You know, when he was being successful, Saks would come in and say, you know, we want to put a Saks right down in town in Charleston on the main street, on King Street, but we need to tear down 3 buildings because one, we need some parking, and our footprint for our building needs to look like this. And Joe said, you know, we really want Saks to be here, but you're not tearing any buildings down. Figure out how to make it work in the 3 existing buildings. And then when you see King Street, you will understand why that happened. Why it would have been a missing tooth right there in the middle of Joe's city. And it was a remarkable example of what leadership is about, of having values and sticking with those values and not willing to sell out at the first opportunity. And the other is strong partnerships of how do you bring people together. This is about leadership, but this is about how you have a common vision. So the Research Triangle is a great example in Raleigh. You know, that was an area. True story, 6 guys get rained out of a golf game in the early 60s, and they're lamenting the fact that they spend all this money to send their kids to college, and then they never come back because all there was to do in the Raleigh area was tobacco and furniture making. And those 6 guys on their own went and bought 7,000 acres of property. They called it the Research Triangle. And they partnered with the universities there, and they partnered with the business community. It is now has the highest per capita income and the highest educational level of any place in America. That is what leadership was about. That's what partnership is about, of people that could see where they ought to go. And the other I mentioned, talent. Talent is everything. China understands that. China has tripled the number of people in universities in the last 10 years in China that are going to universities because they recognize that the world is driven by talent and by innovation that talent will do, about the willingness to take risk. And finally, you've heard a lot about placemaking. That's the Millennium Park. You know, it was an old railroad yard, and Mayor Daley wanted to put a grass field and a two-car parking garage underneath the grass field. And he went to the business community and philanthropic community and said, let's raise some money to do that. And they said, well, if you want to do that, let's not do a parking garage with a grass field on it. Let's do something world class. And if you've been to Millennium Park, you know it is the most visited place in Chicago now. There's $2 billion plus of development around it because it is a world-class place. And that's your choice here. I hope you leave here motivated to want to do something in Norman. So when I drive in from the airport and there's a sign that says, welcome to Norman, do you want to have on that side, welcome to Norman, we're an it'll-do city? Is that what you want on that sign? Or do you want to say, welcome to Norman, we're a world-class city? That's a choice you're making. It's a choice not only about what's on that sign, because I know you're not going to put we're an it'll-do community. It's a choice about the kind of community you want to have, of what you require when people build buildings. You have remarkable pieces here. You have a great university. You have some interesting history and buildings in this town. The challenge is not ever about whether we have money, because you're always here, we don't have any money to do this, and it's not about whether you have interest. This is a community that has a developer interest. The challenge is about your community will, of whether you're willing to sort of say, we're doing okay, and let's just stay here, or let's challenge ourselves to reach and recognize that we are where Horatio Nelson Jackson was. We're looking at a world where the rules are getting changed. And if you don't understand that, if you're not willing to take the risk to reach for the future, you will be left behind. That's the challenge of every city in the world today. Good luck.